So we're going to talk in this lecture about chromosomal aberrations. So remember, your DNA is organized into segments called chromosomes. So a chromosome can have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of genes on it. What happens if there's something that goes wrong with a chromosome? Well, there are two different ways we can have chromosomal abnormalities. Aberrations is just a fancy word for, well, close enough to abnormalities. We can have structural problems. These are physical changes in the chromosome. And the severity of these depends on which chromosome is involved, what part of the chromosome is involved, how big is that aberration. We can also have what are called numerical aberrations, where instead of having two copies of each chromosome, you have a condition called aneuploidy, where you have either one copy of a chromosome or three, or sometimes more copies of a chromosome. We're going to start talking about the structural abnormalities. With these abnormalities, size matters. The larger the area that is abnormal, the more significant the problems are going to be. So if these abnormalities show up in only a few cells in someone who's especially already reached adulthood, chances are those cells are just going to die, not have a significant impact on you at all. If it happens before birth, especially early before birth, then it's going to have a much bigger problem. These sorts of aberrations are rare. The more severe versions are not going to produce a viable offspring, which might result in a stillbirth or a miscarriage, most likely a miscarriage. Now, the one place you will see these chromosomal abnormalities is in cancer cells. Remember, cancer cells turn off the process of apoptosis or programmed cell death, the process that causes cells with things like these chromosomal abnormalities to die. This image shows you a bunch of different types of abnormalities. We can have a deletion where a segment of a chromosome is lost. We can have a duplication where a segment of a chromosome, you have an extra copy of that section. Some genes, the dosage matters. So if you have two copies of a gene, you might end up with too much of the protein that codes for. You can have what's called an inversion, where a section of the chromosome is flipped. This matters because your DNA is read in a specific direction. And by read, I mean the instructions go in a specific direction. And if you've reversed part of those instructions, it's like trying to read something that's backwards. So I said a few minutes ago, structural aberrations are rare. An inversion, that would be rare are aberrations structural. It's not going to work if you invert it, usually. Those kinds of problems generally occur within one chromosome, and you've got one chromosome affected. But you can have what are called substitutions and translocations where multiple chromosomes are involved. So a substitution occurs when a section of one chromosome is cut out and a section of a different chromosome ends up in that spot. That can be a huge issue. Translocations occur where two different chromosomes swap part of their genetic information. Again, this can cause huge problems. But size matters. When in your lifespan these mutations happen matters. What genes are involved matters. So there's a lot of diversity here. Then there are what are called numerical chromosomal aberrations, or aneuploidy. These occur when there's a mistake in meiosis that results in the sperm or the egg either having no copies of a specific chromosome or having two copies of a specific chromosome. They also occur in cancer cells. This image shows you a human male chromosome. This is pictures of the actual chromosomes. And you can see two copies of chromosome 1, two copies of chromosome 2, two copies of chromosome 3. That is what you normally expect. But then you get to chromosome 13 and you see 3 of them. This is an aneuploidy, specifically called a trisomy. 3 copies. So either the sperm or the egg had 2 copies of chromosome 13 in it. The fertilized egg now has 3 copies. When we talk about aneuploidies, I didn't break that down for you. Aneuploidy, the AN means without, the EU refers to true, and the ploidy refers to the number of chromosomes. So aneuploidy literally means without the true or normal number of chromosomes. Most aneuploidies are lethal. Chromosome 13 triploidy is lethal. Trisomy 13 children can survive. Some survive to birth. Some survive a few days after birth. But it's not long-term survivable. And again, which chromosomes are involved matters. We don't see viable pregnancies with a lot of these trisomies. The other version is what's called a monosomy. Mono means one, so there's one copy of a chromosome. There's only one monosomy that is survivable, and that is monosomy for sex chromosomes. And that's only if the embryo or the fertilized egg has an X. But we're going to get to that in a second. The major exception to the rule about these aneuploidies being lethal is Down syndrome. This is trisomy 21, 3 copies of chromosome 21. And people with Down syndromes generally have some level of intellectual or developmental delays. How much varies dramatically. They are at increased risk of thyroid disease and heart disease. But modern medical care can help these patients these people live productive, satisfying, and long lives. The other trisomies, as I mentioned, don't tend to survive. Now, the other big exception to the rule about aneuploidies are when we talk about the sex chromosomes. So, let me state this again. Aneuploidies, or abnormal numbers of chromosomes, are lethal, usually before birth, occasionally within the few weeks after birth, except for trisomy 21, or if the sex chromosomes are involved. So let's talk about the sex chromosomes. When we talk about sex in humans, there are multiple ways to determine sex. Genetically, we say XX is female and XY is male, but there are other options for the sex chromosomes. We might look at the gametes produced. Gametes are sperm and egg. If you produce sperm, we generally call you male. If you produce eggs, we generally call you female. We could look at the hormones produced. Now, everybody produces testosterone, but the amount of testosterone you produce varies. So people with high levels of testosterone, generally male. Same thing with estrogen. High levels of estrogen, predominantly considered to be female. But there are people who produce, going to get back to that. Hang on. Skipped a line here in my notes. Generally speaking, when you are born, sex is determined or designated based on the appearance of your genitalia. People with penises, they mark the male box on the birth certificate. People with vaginas, they mark the female box. But here's the thing. There are people who are born with genitalia that is not distinctly male or female. We call this condition intersex. This is not the same thing as a hermaphrodite. True hermaphrodites are animals that produce both sperm and eggs. This does not happen in humans because the testes that produce the sperm and the ovaries that produce the egg develop from the same starting structure early in embryonic development. So you've got one clump of tissue that's going to become a gonad. And it's either going to be a testis or an ovary. Okay, I also need to clear up the difference between sex and gender. When we look at these different definitions for designating sex, they do not always line up. And we generally call any time where these different ways of determining sex don't line up intersex. So you could be genetically XY but have a vagina. So your genetic code and your genitalia do not match up. That's intersex. That's one option for intersex. And sex is biological. Gender is social. It's a personal determination of whether you are male, female, or non-binary. And this is generally determined before age 3. By the age of 3, if you ask a child, are you a boy or a girl, they will have an answer. And it may be what they were taught, but it's not always what they were taught. And if it's not what they were taught, then they are transgender. Their biological sex traits and their gender don't match. Okay, so now that we're clear on sex and gender, let's talk about chromosomal aberrations and sex. All humans need an X chromosome. If a fertilized egg does not have an X chromosome, it might not result in a pregnancy, or it will result in a miscarriage early in the pregnancy. You can't survive with Y chromosome alone. People with only one X chromosome have a condition called Turner's syndrome. They tend to be short and infertile, but they're often not diagnosed until puberty or even later in life. They do have a slightly shorter life expectancy with an increased risk for diabetes, thyroid hormone problems, heart defects, but many of them live to be have the same lifespan as people with two X chromosomes. And mentally, people with Turner syndrome are completely normal. You can have 3 X chromosomes. People with 3 X chromosomes tend to be a little tall, but many women have this with no symptoms and may never be diagnosed. With the rise in having your genes looked at, we're starting to see this we're starting to realize this is more common than we thought. People with 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y chromosome tend to be what we call feminized males. These can be treated with supplemental testosterone, but they may have small breasts develop, and they often produce little or no sperm, so fertility is an issue. Again, they are mentally normal. People with XYY tend to have no symptoms and may never be diagnosed. And again, it's one of those things that's turning out to be more common than we realized. So, chromosomal aberrations with the sex chromosomes, the X and the Y, often result in a relatively normal, healthy life for these individuals. And a lot of them are never diagnosed. Okay, and so that's the overview of chromosomal abnormalities. To sum it up again here at the end, aneuploidies of the chromosomes that are not the sex chromosomes are usually lethal, except for Down syndrome, trisomy 21. But aneuploidies of the sex chromosomes, perfectly normal, healthy individuals most of the time may have some increased risk of certain conditions as long as there's at least one X chromosome.